When Shirley Temple turned 18 in 1946, she discovered something that would have destroyed a normal child's faith in their parents forever. Of the $3.2 million she had earned as the most profitable child star in Hollywood history, that's roughly $45 million in today's money, only $44,000 remained. Her father had spent almost everything. He didn't steal it outright. He just spent it on houses, on living a lifestyle that only existed because of his daughter's face on a screen. And the worst part, it was legal. Nobody went to jail. Nobody even apologized. That was Hollywood's golden age, not the glamorous one you saw in the movies, but the one that happened in the studio backlots, the dressing rooms, and the homes where the contracts followed the child stars, even on their darkest days. What made this possible wasn't just bad parenting. It was a complete absence of rules. In the 1920s and 1930s, there were no child labor laws in Hollywood. The industry didn't exist when those laws were written, so the studios made their own rules, and they made them to protect profit, not children. A 6-year-old could work 14-hour days. A 10-year-old could be given prescription drugs to stay awake. There were no mandatory breaks, no education requirements, no oversight. Parents who had one talented kid didn't see a child who needed protection. They saw a meal ticket. The studio didn't see a kid either. They saw an asset. And the child, well, the child learned very early that their value came from what they could earn, not who they were. Let's start with someone you probably know. Judy Garland didn't choose to be a star. Her mother, Ethel Gum, chose it for her. By the time Judy was 4 years old, she was already performing in her mother's vaudeville act in a small theater. Her mother saw something that most people would recognize as a red flag, talent. But she didn't see it the way a parent sees talent in their child, something to nurture, something to be proud of. She saw it the way a prospector sees gold. Ethel pushed Judy relentlessly through vaudeville, through small parts, and by the time Judy was 13 and signed with MGM, the pattern was already set. Ethel didn't let up. She didn't say, "Now that you've made it, you can have a normal childhood." Instead, she enforced the studio's demands at home. When MGM hired doctors to give Judy amphetamines to keep her weight down, because the camera supposedly made her look heavy, Ethel didn't question it. When they gave her barbiturates to help her sleep after the amphetamines kept her wired all night, Ethel made sure Judy took them. The studio doctor would hand over pills, and Ethel would stand there like a prison guard, watching her daughter swallow them. The studio doctors know what they're doing, Ethel would say when Judy complained. Do you want a career or not? What Ethel didn't understand, or didn't care about, was that she was participating in her daughter's addiction. By the time Judy turned 16, she was dependent on these pills. She had severe mood swings, weight problems, and a body that was already showing signs of breaking down. And yet MGM kept her working. They had a contract. They had box office. They had money to make. In one of the cruelest ironies of Hollywood history, Judy became one of the studio's most profitable stars. And when she finally grew up and looked at her bank account, she found that after years of being the studio's workhorse, there was nothing left. Her mother had spent it all. Ethel never faced consequences. She spent her remaining years telling people that she had done the right thing, that Judy was grateful for the discipline, that without her, Judy would have been nothing. Judy spent her remaining years fighting addiction, depression, and the knowledge that the person who was supposed to protect her had been profiting from her exploitation. Shirley Temple was different from Judy Garland in one important way. Her parents weren't stage parents. George and Gertrude Temple didn't push Shirley into show business out of ambition. They were just going to protect their daughter's money and make sure she got a normal life. That was the plan. Shirley's career exploded in the early 1930s at 20th Century Fox. She made movie after movie. America was in the Depression. People were losing their homes, and Shirley Temple was the thing that made them feel okay for 90 minutes. Her dimples and her talent were worth millions, and for a while, her parents tried to manage it responsibly. They made sure she went to school. They made sure she had time to be a kid. But over time, something shifted. The money kept coming in, and the lifestyle kept getting bigger. Shirley's parents were living in a large house in Los Angeles. They were traveling. They were making investments, and those investments required money, a lot of it. So George Temple started using Shirley's earnings to fund increasingly risky business ventures, real estate deals that didn't pan out, business investments that collapsed. Money just seemed to disappear. By the time Shirley turned 18 and finally had legal access to her own finances, she discovered that $3.2 million had been reduced to $44,000. Her father wasn't a criminal. He was just a man who had access to his child's enormous income with absolutely no legal oversight, and the system allowed him to spend it any way he wanted. Shirley didn't become bitter about it. In later interviews, she talked about it more as a misunderstanding than a betrayal, but the impact was real. She had given the entire country joy as a child, and she had nothing to show for it except the legal precedent to finally change the laws. After Shirley's story became public, California passed the Coogan Law in 1939, named after another child star, Jackie Coogan, who had experienced similar financial exploitation after starring with Charlie Chaplin in The Kid in 1921. The law required that a percentage of child actors' earnings be put in blocked trust accounts that parents couldn't touch. It was a small victory, and it came far too late for Shirley Temple. Jean Harlow was different because her mother never wanted her to be a star in the first place. Jean Harlow wanted it for herself. She was a girl from Kansas City who was beautiful and ambitious and wanted to escape her small-town life. Her mother, Joan Bellow, had once been drawn to performing too, but when that didn't work out, she gave up. She married, had a daughter, and let that dream die. Until her daughter Harleen, who would become Jean Harlow, started to notice the same pull toward performance that had called to her mother. And that's when Joan Bellow did something many stage mothers do. She projected her failure onto her daughter's success. Whatever Jean Harlow accomplished, whatever roles she got, whatever fame she achieved, it was all happening under her mother's control. Joan Bellow managed every contract, every interview, every public appearance. By the time Jean Harlow was in her early 20s, she was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, the platinum blonde who men wanted to see and women wanted to be, and she was completely owned by her mother. Reporters saw glamour. People who actually knew her saw someone trapped. Harlow was sick. She had kidney problems that would eventually kill her, but her mother wouldn't let her stop working. She wouldn't let her see a doctor if she thought it might damage her image. Jean Harlow was making too much money for her mother to let something like health get in the way. When Jean Harlow died at just 26 years old, her mother never recovered from the loss of the income. She had built her entire life on her daughter's earnings and talent, and when that was gone, she had nothing. Joan Crawford was a different kind of monster. She was a parent who didn't exploit her child's talent for money. She exploited her child for control. She had been rejected and humiliated as a young woman in Hollywood, and by the time she became a mother, she was determined that no one would ever make her feel powerless again, not even her own daughter. Christina Crawford lived in her mother's house and lived according to her mother's rules, and the rules were brutal. Joan Crawford was obsessed with perfection, with discipline, with absolute obedience. When Christina came home with a wire hanger in her closet, something that most of us wouldn't even notice, Joan Crawford beat her. Not a spanking, a beating. The details of that incident would become so famous that they're now part of pop culture history. But what most people don't realize is that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was routine. This was how Joan Crawford parented. She would conduct surprise inspections of the house, checking for dust and disorder. If the house wasn't perfect, Christina would be punished. She would wake Christina up in the middle of the night to check her hygiene and her posture. She would force her to sleep on concrete floors as punishment. And worst of all, she did it all while performing as America's most glamorous mother. She would get ready for her movie premieres, put on her makeup, smile for the cameras, and then come home and make her daughter's life a nightmare. When Christina finally wrote about her childhood in her memoir, Mommy Dearest, the public was shocked. But Joan Crawford wasn't shocked. She denied everything. She said her daughter was exaggerating. She said Christina was an ungrateful daughter who didn't understand the discipline required to raise a successful child. And when Joan Crawford died, she made sure that Christina wouldn't profit from her estate. In her will, she wrote, "It is my intention to make no provision herein for my son Christopher or my daughter Christina, for reasons which are well known to them." She didn't just abuse her daughter, she disinherited her. And she did it with a statement that basically said the world would understand why. Bing Crosby was America's favorite singer. Every Christmas, families would gather around the radio, or later the television, to hear him sing White Christmas. He was the voice of warmth, of home, of everything that was good about American families, and he had a carefully constructed image as a loving father. His Christmas special showed him surrounded by his talented sons, all of them singing together, all of them looking happy and grateful to have such a warm father. Gary Crosby, his eldest son, let people believe that for most of his life. But in 1983, he published a memoir called Going My Own Way that revealed something the world wasn't prepared to hear. His father wasn't warm. His father was cruel. Gary described regular weigh-ins where his father would measure not just whether the boys had gained weight, but how much. If they had gained more than 2 pounds, they would be beaten with a cane, with a belt, with whatever was handy. These weren't minor punishments. They left welts. They left bruises. Gary's brothers, Philip and Dennis, confirmed the story. They had been beaten too. And what makes it almost worse is that when people initially heard these stories, they didn't believe them. Bing Crosby was too likable. He was too American. The idea that he could be violent at home didn't fit with the image he had created. But the image was a lie. The same man who would step off a stage and smile at the cameras would go home and beat his children if they disappointed him. The same man who sang about peace on earth and goodwill toward men would tell his sons that showing emotion was weakness, that crying was a failure, that they needed to be hard, cold, and obedient. And it worked. The Crosby sons learned their lesson well. 2 of them eventually took their own lives. Natalie Wood was born Natasha Gurdon. She had a mother named Maria, who consulted a fortune teller before Natasha was even born. According to family accounts, the fortune teller made a prediction: your daughter will become famous, but she will die in dark water. Most people would hear that prediction and run. Most people would say, I don't care about fame. I want my daughter to be safe. Maria Gurdon heard that prediction and became obsessed with making the first part come true as quickly as possible. She pushed Natasha into show business at age 4, before the girl even understood what acting was. She coached her on how to charm directors. She taught her how to flirt with powerful men, and she seemed completely blind to, or completely accepting of, the fact that she was putting her young daughter in rooms alone with adult men who had complete control over her career. By the time Natalie Wood was a teenager, she had spent her entire childhood performing. She had missed out on normal childhood experiences. She had never learned to develop genuine relationships because she had always been performing. And worse, she had learned to view relationships as transactional. Men wanted something from her. She needed something from them. That was love. That was how the world worked. In 1981, Natalie Wood drowned off Catalina Island under circumstances that have never been fully explained. She was found in the water. She was afraid of water. Some people say it was an accident. Some say it was something else. But what we do know is that she had spent her entire life drowning in her mother's expectations. And on that final day, maybe the literal drowning was just an echo of what had been happening all along. You start to see a pattern when you look at these stories. It's not just that Hollywood was a bad place for children. It's that the system was designed to extract maximum value from them while giving them minimum protection. Parents were complicit because they were hungry. Studios were complicit because they were profitable. And society was complicit because we loved the product. We went to the movies and we loved Shirley Temple's dimples. We listened to Bing Crosby's voice. We didn't ask questions about what it cost these children. And by the time we found out, the damage was already done. The stories I've told you so far are the famous ones. They're the ones we know about because the children survived long enough to tell their stories. But there were thousands of children in Hollywood during the Golden Age who had similar experiences. Some of them didn't survive. Some of them disappeared into the system, and we never heard from them again. Some of them were so damaged by their experiences that they spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what happened to them. What made it possible was a perfect storm of negligence. There were no labor laws protecting child actors. There was no mandatory education. There was no psychological support. There was no oversight. A studio could take a talented child, work them 14 hours a day, give them prescription drugs, subject them to emotional abuse and manipulation, and nobody could stop them. The only people who could have protected these children were their parents, and their parents were often so grateful for the opportunity that they became enforcers instead of protectors. The studio system also created a specific kind of power imbalance. A child actor didn't work for their parents. They worked for a studio. The studio held the contract. The studio controlled the roles. The studio decided whether the child was allowed to have friends, attend school, or have any kind of normal childhood. And the parents couldn't protect them because the studio controlled their income too. If you pushed back too hard, your child could be written out of the contract. Your child could lose the role that was making your family's fortune. So parents stayed quiet. They enabled. They participated. What happened to child stars in Hollywood's golden age wasn't just a bunch of tragic stories. It was a systemic failure. It was adults making choices that harmed children because those choices were profitable or convenient. And the reason I'm telling you this isn't to make you feel bad about loving those old movies. It's to make you understand what they cost. Every time you watch a Shirley Temple film or listen to Judy Garland sing, you're watching the product of a system that extracted a price from these children that we're still calculating. The good news is that things changed. The Coogan Law passed. Child labor laws eventually expanded. Organizations like the Screen Actors Guild began advocating for child actor protections. Social awareness grew, but it took decades. It took these children growing up and being brave enough to tell their stories. It took damage that could never be repaired. So the next time you're looking at old Hollywood, remember the faces we know and the thousands of faces we don't. And maybe ask yourself, what are we not seeing about the entertainment industry today?